It was early December, and the first real snowstorm of the season had rolled in. I had the day off and spent it huddled in my little cabin in the woods, the fire crackling and the wind howling against the windows. I kept the TV on low, cycling through news updates that warned of heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures worsening overnight. By dusk, the world outside was completely white, and the sharp whistle of the wind sent an occasional shiver down my spine. Around 7 p.m., I pulled a heavy quilt over my shoulders and settled onto the couch with a mug of tea. The storm outside had escalated to a full-on blizzard, and visibility was almost non-existent. I remember glancing toward the sliding glass doors that led to my back porch. Through the distorted swirls of snow, I noticed something or someone moving at the edge of my property. It was a figure walking slowly but deliberately through the snow. The woods backed right up to my yard, and no one had any business being out there in weather like this. The figure disappeared into the thick curtain of snow, and despite the fire and blanket, I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft raps, as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to draw too much attention. I hesitated for a long moment before cautiously walking over and peeking through the peephole. There stood a man, bundled in a heavy brown coat with a scarf wrapped around most of his face. Snow clung to his shoulders, and his skin was pale, almost bluish. When he saw me looking, he gave a faint smile and raised a trembling hand in a weak wave. "Please," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down about a mile back. I just need somewhere to warm up for a few minutes." There's an instinct buried deep in most of us that whispers when something feels off. It was screaming at me then. "I can't let you in," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "But I can bring you a blanket or some hot tea if you'd like to wait on the porch." The man's smile faltered. He nodded slowly, stepping to the side to sit down on the porch swing. I shut the door, locked it, and hurried to the closet to grab an old blanket. As I returned to the door, blanket in hand, something made me stop. I don't know if it was a sound or just a deep, unshakable feeling, but I paused just before unlocking the deadbolt and leaned to look through the peephole again. The man wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing right at the door, so close that his breath fogged up the glass. One of his hands was on the doorknob, fingers twitching slightly as if testing to see if it would turn. I took several steps back, clutching my phone in one hand as I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator answered, and I explained in a whisper what was happening. As I spoke, I kept my eyes locked on the door. But when I glanced through the peephole again, he was gone. The porch was empty, and the snow on the steps was undisturbed, almost as if no one had ever been there at all. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They checked around the cabin and the surrounding woods, but didn't find any footprints, tire tracks, or any other evidence of someone having been there. One of the officers tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a drifter trying his luck and leaving when he realized help wasn't coming. But I can't shake the feeling that the man hadn't been planning to leave at all. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house and kept the fire burning until dawn. I never saw the man again, but every winter when the first snowstorm rolls in, I find myself glancing at the porch, half expecting to see him standing there, hand on the doorknob, waiting. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. Last winter, I was driving home for the holidays. My family lives about 16 hours away, and I usually push through in one long, exhausting drive. But this year, the snow had come early, and the roads were slow and treacherous. I accepted that I'd probably need to stop somewhere overnight. I didn't book anything in advance since I wasn't sure how far I'd make it. The snow had started lightly when I left, just a delicate dusting on the highway. But as the hours passed, it thickened. Traffic crawled. By 9 p.m., I'd barely covered half the distance. The frustration was mounting. The snowplows were nowhere in sight, and the thought of spending another 7 or 8 hours behind the wheel tomorrow made me want to scream. Around midnight, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I spotted a worn-out road sign for a motel at the next exit and took the turn. The place wasn't much to look at. A single-story strip of faded rooms with flickering neon lights spelling out vacancy. The parking lot was blanketed in snow, tire tracks barely visible. I pulled in and parked near the front office. Inside, the lobby was tiny and outdated, the smell of stale coffee and mildew hanging heavy in the air. A handwritten sign sat on the counter. Back in 15 minutes. There was a little doodle of a steaming coffee cup beside it. I sighed and went back to my car. That's when I noticed something odd. The parking lot was completely empty. Not a single car, no tire tracks showing fresh arrivals. Nothing. I leaned back in my seat, watching the snow whip across my windshield, and tried to convince myself that the manager had just stepped out briefly. Maybe they walked to a nearby gas station. The heater hummed softly as I adjusted my seat and decided to close my eyes, just for a few minutes. When I woke up, the car was cold again. My windshield was half covered in a thick layer of snow, and the storm had intensified. The clock on my dash read 3:27 a.m. As I rubbed my eyes, I froze. Someone was standing just outside my driver's side window, staring straight at me. I jerked upright, and the man flinched back a step. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but I could see enough of it to notice the sharpness in his eyes. He turned his head and shouted something into the snowy darkness. That's when I noticed headlights cutting through the storm from a large pickup truck parked across the lot. Another man stepped out of the driver's side and started walking toward me. The first guy circled around my car, yanking on the door handles one by one. The second man joined him, and they began murmuring to each other before one of them sprinted back to the truck and returned with something. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked heavy. My heart was hammering as I jammed the car into reverse. The tires spun uselessly against the snow-packed pavement. I tried again, rocking the car back and forth, but I wasn't moving fast enough. The sharp sound of glass shattering filled the air. The back window behind me exploded inward, and icy shards rained over the back seat. One of the men reached through the broken glass, fumbling for the door lock. My breath caught as I slammed my foot down on the gas. The car finally lurched backward, skidding violently to one side. The man reaching through the window lost his balance and tumbled out into the snow. The other guys sprinted back to the truck, but I didn't wait to see if they'd follow. I gripped the wheel, spun my car around, and fishtailed my way out of the parking lot. For a few agonizing seconds, I could see their truck's headlights in my rearview mirror, but they didn't follow me onto the main road. Instead, they disappeared into the swirling snow, swallowed by the storm. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I parked at a well-lit gas station, shaking so hard I could barely pull my phone out to call the police. They took my report, but I could tell from their tone that they weren't too optimistic about catching anyone. Looking back, I still kick myself for falling asleep in that parking lot. Maybe I should have kept driving or picked a bigger hotel off the main road. But those men, they were prepared. Their timing, their movements. It felt like they had done this before, maybe many times. Whatever they had planned, I'm grateful I never had to find out. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. Last winter break, I picked up work delivering food for DoorDash. It's the easiest way to make quick cash without interviews or training. College was out for the month, and I needed enough money to hold me over until spring semester. My dad let me borrow his old pickup truck, which was better suited for snowy roads than my beat-up little sedan. It was about 2 weeks before Christmas, and the snow had been falling steadily all day. Most people were hunkered down at home, which worked in my favor. I was getting constant orders, and the tips were generous. I'd been at it for hours when one last order popped up around 11 p.m. The pickup was from a nearby KFC, and the delivery address was about 20 minutes away. The payout was solid, so I accepted it. The map showed the house was tucked inside one of those older, wealthier neighborhoods across the county. The kind with sprawling yards, tall iron gates, and houses set far back from the road. I'd driven past the area before, but never delivered inside. The snow had really started to pile up by the time I reached the neighborhood. The streetlights glowed dimly through the thick flakes, and most houses were dark, their owners likely asleep. As I made my way through the winding streets, I couldn't help but notice how eerie it felt. Huge homes, spaced far apart, completely silent under the weight of snow. When I reached the delivery address, I realized the driveway hadn't been plowed at all. There was at least a foot of snow blocking the path, so I parked along the curb and started trudging up to the house with the bag of food clutched in my hand. Snow immediately began soaking into my shoes and jeans, and I muttered curses under my breath. The house was enormous, but completely dark, not a single light on. As I reached the front door, I noticed a piece of paper taped to it. In bold red letters at the top, it said, "Notice." Below there was text from the county about the property. But before I could read further, I heard a sound behind me, the crunch of boots in snow. I turned around and saw a man emerging from the side of the garage. He was wearing a dirty, oversized jacket, and his hair was buzzed short. His face was pale, and his eyes. Something about them felt hollow, sunken. "Just dropping off your order," I said, holding out the bag toward him. He didn't respond. He just walked up to me slowly, hand extended, until I placed the food in his grasp. But instead of turning back toward the house, he just stood there, staring at me. Seconds passed, and my stomach knotted tighter with each one. Why wasn't he going inside? Why had he even come from around the garage instead of the front door? "All right, have a good night, sir," I said, trying to sound casual. I stepped sideways into the snow, attempting to pass him. That's when he lunged. His hand swiped toward my arm, fingers outstretched, but I stumbled back just in time. His voice came low and sharp as he said, "Come with me." My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned and bolted down the driveway. The snow made every step sluggish, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I heard him shouting, "Stop running!" His boots crunched closer and closer in the snow. Somehow I reached the truck, yanked open the door, and slammed it shut just as he reached the tailgate. I shoved the keys into the ignition, reversed out of the snowbank with my tires spinning and screeching, and sped away from the house. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing at the edge of the driveway, barely illuminated by the truck's taillights. He wasn't chasing anymore. He was just watching. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station a few miles away. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial 911. I told the dispatcher everything, every detail I could remember. The police called me back a few hours later with an update. The house wasn't occupied. It had been foreclosed months ago and was currently listed as vacant. Whatever the paper on the door said was probably related to that. But the man? They didn't know who he was or where he'd gone. Even now, months later, I can't pull up to a darkened house for a delivery without feeling that same cold dread crawl up my spine. I always catch myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that pale face and hollow eyes staring back at me from the dark.